moving this one or speaking to this one, because all we are saying in this amendment and in the amendment so well moved by the noble Lord Panic and supported by my noble friend Lord Heseltine and others, all we are saying is that Parliament's right and duty must be on the face of the bill. It's not a question of the integrity of those who have made statements. Of course, I accept that without any question whatsoever. But there is a difference between a statement expressing intent and a legal obligation. And that, my lords, is what we're seeking to insert in this bill. A legal obligation which should be recognised. And I very, very much hope that even at this late stage, my noble friend from the front bench will feel able to acknowledge at least that there is some validity in what we are seeking to say. And I very much hope that in the other place they will reconsider. It does not delay the passage of this bill by more than a day. We can get it through this House in all its remaining stages next week. It doesn't in any sense alter the intent or purpose of the bill, because it gives to the Prime Minister what she has asked for. But, my lords, whilst I sincerely hope that the Prime Minister is in rude and vigorous health for many years to come and is still in office long after the sad day when we have vacated the European Union, nevertheless, we cannot guarantee that that will be the case. And one Prime Minister cannot necessarily bind her successor. Look at the changes that took place in June and July of last year. How were the mighty fallen? My lords, I would urge you, when we come to vote, unless my noble friend is able to give us the assurances we seek, that we do vote to put Parliament in its rightful place. House of Commons first, but the House of Lords, this noble House, in its proper position, able to say, please reconsider, able to say, we genuinely do not think you've got this right. I'm just going to finish. Genuinely able to say, we do not think you've got this right. Of course, if they take a different line, we recognise the limitations on our power. But, my lords, let us send a message tonight to the other place.
Well, before my noble
My lords, I hope you will permit me to think aloud with you. These are not already crystallized thoughts. I had that exchange between Lord Panic, Hannay, and Lord Forsyth. I am still in a state of wanting to work out some of the complications. Amendment 3, I think for me, provides the intrusion of Parliament into negotiation processes, which I don't think we should, in such a way that it can prevent any deal ever being reached, because we are involving ourselves into the processes themselves. It also, and the question has not been quite fully answered, it says 3 times, without the approval of both houses of Parliament, prior to the approval of houses of Parliament is required. Thirdly, prior to the approval of both houses of Parliament shall be required. The question has got to be answered. What happens when this House does not agree with the other House? Somebody's got to answer that, because you are saying both must be. If we don't agree with the other, it will give the unelected House almost a veto on the procedure to reach an agreement with the EU, which in turn forced the decision made by the electorate in the 2016 referendum. That has got to be answered. The commitment by the Prime Minister in January 2017 as the role of Parliament, I think that commitment goes above and beyond what is contained in the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act of 2010. I think she went just beyond it. My lords, I invite you to look at that act. I think she said more than what is allowed in that act of constitutional reform. I would suggest it's not in Parliament's gift to make this a condition, as the European Union might well refuse to negotiate or agree not to extend the negotiations. I don't think that's in our gift. The Prime Minister's spokesman, of course, said yesterday we should not commit to any process that would incentivize the EU to offer us a bad deal. Any deal that could be rejected by MPs would give strength to other parties in the negotiation. We believe it should be a simple bill in relation to triggering Article 50 and nothing else. Triggering Article 50, for me, it seems, and I think Lord Honey was trying to say the same thing, is an irreversible act. 2 years after triggering Article 50, the UK will leave the EU. It will do so with or without a deal, but neither way actually leave it will. Article 50, paragraph 3, makes clear that the treaties will cease to apply 2 years after notification has actually been made. It is possible that the EU 27 members might unanimously agree to extend the negotiation period between 2 years, but this cannot be taken for granted, nor should it be assumed that we will offer anything but a brief extension. This amendment shows no awareness, it seems to me, as the reality is presented by Article 50 time frame. And you've got to answer it, you've got to put it in. Yes, it may sound like rubbish, but that answer has got to be given. Section 3. This amendment, I think, also overlooks that the European Union notification of withdrawal bill is about triggering Article 50 and the formal divorce settlement. Neither this bill nor Article 50 are about negotiating a new agreement with the EU. My lords, mine is fides quaerens intellectum, faith-seeking understanding. Could somebody explain? Because if I can't get a clear answer to those questions are posed, I think I may find myself voting no. But if I'm made to understand, then I may vote yes.
My lords, like the noble Lord Foulkes, I arrived this morning for Amendment 1, not sure which way I would vote, but very clear that I was going to be a strong supporter of this amendment. Like him also, I thought that there was a link between the two, but my resolution was somewhat different, which is that I did not vote for this morning's amendment, but I still strongly support this. One of the difficulties that I have found with these debates as to how we should think about the finality of the vote on June the 23rd last year is that I find myself disagreeing with arguments on either side. On the side of those who, like me, voted Remain, it is often suggested that there was something about that vote which was less legitimate than other votes, because perhaps there was 16 to 18-year-olds didn't have the vote, or because the Leave side lied. But I do not consider those reasonable arguments. You may or may not be in favour of 16 to 18-year-olds having the vote, but our present system is that voting starts at 18, and that doesn't change the legitimacy of a general election result or a referendum result. And as for the argument that the Leave side exaggerated, or perhaps with the NHS claim lied, well, I do think there were some exaggerations on the other side as well. And I have to say that in every general election I can ever remember, there have been exaggerations on either side, some of which have verged on the mendacious, but they have not invalidated the result of the general election. Democracy is scrappy, it is imperfect, but it is the best system we have. So I accept the result of what happened last year as no more and no less legitimate than any general election. But that means, as well as being no less legitimate, it is also no more. And it is the case that on the day after a general election, and my noble Lord Heseltine has already said this, the opposition party, be they Labour or Conservative or Liberal Democrat, devote themselves the very next day to arguing against what was just agreed by the majority of the population, by putting down amendments in the Commons or the Lords, by trying to delay things in the Lords, and by working day after day to win the next general election, and in some cases working very hard to bring it forward if they possibly can, as a very fine play that you can go and see in London now records, from the days in the Commons of several people presently in this House. So I do very much agree with the sentiment of the noble Lord Kerr that any idea that the vote on last June reflects the will of the people in some unanimous, all the people together, una voce, unanimous, absolute and forever unchanging fashion, is, as my noble lord put it, not democratic, but the Brezhnev doctrine. And like him, I have been a bit surprised and depressed by the fact that this Brezhnev doctrine, having been first propagated by some of our major newspapers, is now finding an echo chamber among some parts, though definitely not all parts, of the Conservative Party, who, on the basis of what Lord Taverne said earlier, I do wish would pay more attention to the intellectual lineage of Edmund Burke than of Leonid Brezhnev. So I think that any idea that to have another referendum in 3 years after the last, or 4 years after the last, or 5 years after the last, the idea that that is undemocratic is nonsense. Indeed, the idea that you should reject that possibility, reject the possibility of another referendum in principle, is in itself undemocratic. And if it so happened that there was another referendum in 3 or 4 or 5 or 20 years' time in which there was a majority for staying in the European Union, that would be equally democratic, no more and no less than the vote that occurred on June the 23rd. But still, I did not support Amendment 1, because I am not sure that there should be a referendum in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time, and I do not think that by a referendum we can resolve the uncertainties and the issues which will we face in 2 years' time, but I do think we can resolve them, and we should resolve them by having extensive parliamentary debates at that time. We simply do not know what will be the result of the negotiations, nor do we know what the situation will be in 2 years' time. It may be that adverse consequences have emerged from the expectation of leaving the European Union. It may be that they will not. I do not know. And I therefore do not think it would be appropriate now to commit to a future referendum, nor do I think we can be sure how we would interpret the result of a referendum if we then had one. Yeah, my noble lord.
I wonder if the noble lord would... I think you have to sit down. Yeah. I'm most grateful to the noble lord. I just wonder if he's picked up the wrong notes for the wrong speech. He seems to be talking about the second referendum.
I am going to come very, very shortly and briefly to why I think these arguments precisely argue that we should have a parliamentary debate. I do not think it is appropriate to commit now to a future referendum, because I do not think you can know now what the meaning of a no vote in a future referendum would mean. Would it be a vote against a result which was too soft or too hard? But I think those arguments against what a referendum are precisely arguments.
I am sorry. I do know that the noble lord wanted to speak to Amendment 1, and perhaps it is a bit frustrating that he's actually now dealing with Amendment 3. But I do think it's important that he addresses his remarks to Amendment 3 and not to Amendment 1, which is a matter which this House has already decided.
What I want to argue, if I may, is that the very arguments why one should not commit to a future referendum, the uncertainty of the situation that we will then face, is, however, the argument why it is absolutely appropriate for us to come back for a detailed debate in both Houses of Parliament at that time to deal with the uncertain circumstances that will then exist. Like others around this House, I would in some ways prefer that this referendum more clearly identified the relative powers of the Commons and the Lords in that process. I would have preferred the earlier version of the amendment, which proposed that there should be an actual legislative process brought forward at that time. But I think the most important principle, and it is the principle which I would assert here, is that we should not treat June the 23rd as providing absolute answers forever, or the answers to everything, and that it is therefore absolutely appropriate for us to assert that there should be a process of parliamentary sovereignty where the details of what it is proposed are brought back to both Houses of Parliament for detailed debate at that time.
My Lords, may I speak to new clause 3, to which I set my name? My Lords, may I speak to my Lords?
My noble friend Viscount Hailsham is in fact a signed signature to this motion before the House. I think it's right the House hear from him, perhaps then from the Labour benches, and then perhaps one of my noble friends from the Conservative benches.
My Lords, those who are putting their names to new clause 3 are not seeking to stand in the way of this bill. Our sole purpose is to ensure that the outcome, agreed terms or no agreed terms, is subject to the unfettered discretion of Parliament. It is, in our view, the Parliament and not the Executive which should be the final arbiter of our country's future. And ironically, in this sense, we stand with the campaigners in the Brexit campaign who wanted Parliament to recover control over policy and legislation. And incidentally, too, we stand in that long tradition of parliamentarians who have stood for the primacy of Parliament against ministerial fiat. In the old days, that was a contest fought on the battlefields, happily more recently in public debate, and of course, most recently of all, in the law courts. It is a conflict that never ceases. Let us not forget that had it not been for the judiciary, we wouldn't have been debating this bill. Oh no, it was the government's intention to trigger Article 50 under the prerogative powers, that is, the residual power of the Crown. Now, my Lords, it is absolutely central to this debate that we should determine the proper interpretation to be given to the referendum last June. I acknowledge at once, albeit I was a Remainer, that the referendum was much more than merely the advisory expression of public opinion. It was much more than that. However, I do deny that it was an authority to this government to leave the European Union, whatever the cost, whatever the terms, whatever the prejudice. That cannot be the case, because the public, when it voted last June, did not know the outcome. It could not know the outcome. And in any event, my Lords, the commitment by the government to subject the ultimate decision to a vote of Parliament undercuts that very proposition. My Lords, I believe that the proper interpretation of the referendum is this. It is an instruction to government to negotiate withdrawal on the best terms that it could get. But that raises an absolutely fundamental question to which this new clause is directed. When the negotiations have crystallised, when there are agreed terms, or perhaps no agreed terms, who determines the way forward? Is it the Executive? Is it Parliament? And that is the old question we have to resolve. And in my view, any believer in a democratic state has to say that the authority lies with Parliament. Now, a very brief reference to the second referendum, very brief. It may be that Parliament 2 years down the track will decide that a second referendum is necessary. They may be justified in doing so. The circumstances may well change. Say in 2 years' time there is a clear change in public sentiment, and say too that Parliament recognises that fact. Is Parliament not then under a duty to test the public opinion? And now I quote the noble Lord, Lord Taverne, who was speaking earlier today, but he spoke in the second reading debate and said this: only dictatorships do not allow people to change their minds. In a democracy, no decision is irreversible. Now, my lords, I want, if I might, to turn to the argument that has been advanced by my noble friend, Lord Hill of Orford, who is indeed a very old friend of mine. And let me say at once that I do acknowledge his experience and authority, which is recent. His view, which I'm sure is going to be adopted by the government, is that if you give to Parliament the kind of powers contemplated by this new clause, you will undercut the negotiating position of the British government. Now, I have to say, my lords and my lord, I don't agree with that view. I share the view, my lords, which was expressed by the noble Lord, Lord O'Donnell, and the noble Lord, Lord Kerr, both citing their own experience, which is very considerable, that the existence of the argument, Parliament will never wear this, reinforces rather than undermines the position of the negotiators. And yes, of course, I give way.
One of the most endearing characteristics of my noble friend is that he can't walk past a wasp's nest without wanting to poke it with a stick. And he has just succeeded. There are two points that I would ask my noble friend to reflect on, which we've already touched on in the course of this debate. The first is, which I'm sure he would agree with me, and I think all noble lords in this House, with a few exceptions, would agree, this is going to be an extremely complex negotiation. Anything that adds to that complexity is strongly to be avoided, in my opinion. I do not agree with those who say this is going to be very simple and we can sort it all out in a matter of time. This is going to be complicated, therefore we should keep things as least complex as we can make them. This amendment, when I listened to the noble Lord Panic set it out, added to my sense that there is complexity and uncertainty contained in this amendment. That would be my first point. My second response to my noble friend about would he perhaps agree with me that in terms of the effect that this might have on a negotiation, the argument that some people used to say that having a parliament behind you or a board behind you in a negotiation enables you to have a stronger position, that is normally when the board or the parliament is adopting a harder line than the person negotiating. In this case, my lords, I have to tell you, our friends in Europe do read our debates. They do read our media. They're highly intelligent, sophisticated negotiators. They know where people sit. So I say, ask my friend, when he says that it would weaken our position, can he not see that there are indeed instances where it would weaken our position because it would make Parliament a player in this negotiation and add complexity to what is already going to be very complex?
My lords, my noble friends has made a very serious point, which enables me to cut directly to the chase, to one of the points I was going to make. My lords, it is possible that my noble friend Lord Hill is right about this. And I would say this: there is sometimes a price to be paid for democracy. Indeed, that is the argument that underpins many of the assertions made by the Brexiteers. They argue, yes, there may be a cost involved in withdrawal, but it is more than compensated by the recovery of democratic control. And that is an argument that also applies, my lord, to the process of negotiation. Yes, of course I give way.
I'm grateful to him. In answer to that very question, can I ask him to cast his mind back to 1991, when, as I recall, he and I were both in the other place, and I think he was a member of the government, if I recall. On that occasion, the then Prime Minister, John Major, brought the Maastricht Treaty to the House for its approval twice. First of all, in seeking a mandate for negotiation, and secondly, afterwards, in seeking the House's approval for what had been negotiated. If that did not weaken his government at the time, why should this weaken this one?
My Lords, I entirely agree with what the noble Lord has said. And also, of course, it is consistent with the principles that underpin Section 20 of the Act of 2010, because that does require all treaties to be ratified by Parliament. My Lords, if I might make a little progress, this government has, in the course of this bill, made a very large number of concessions, and it would be churlish not to welcome that fact. Indeed, I rather hope for more. But I do agree with the views expressed by the noble Lady Baroness Kennedy, and indeed previously by the noble Lord Canning. It is better by far that assurances and concessions of ministers are expressed in statutory language. Because as Lord Oates, the noble Lord Oates has reminded this House, political circumstances may change, ministers may move on, governments may fall. Statutory language is always to be preferred to the comforting words of ministers. And finally, my lords, may I turn to my noble friend, Lord Bridges, a friend of very old standing of mine, and I very much hope that I don't prejudice his future when I say that he has conducted the government's case with great distinction. But, my lord, in his wind-up speech, my noble friend Lord Bridges will doubtless argue, as indeed my noble friend Lord Forsyth has done, that the drafting of this new clause is defective in a number of ingenious ways. It will surprise me if he doesn't advance that argument. But I say to your Lordship's House, ignore that argument. I have carried through several bills through Parliament. I have been party to scores of bills going through Parliament. And the truth is this. When a minister is weak on principle, that minister focuses on the drafting. The reality is as follows. If Parliament as a whole resolves that as a matter of principle, the ultimate authority to determine the future of this country should rest with Parliament and not with the executive, skilled parliamentary counsel will be instructed to ensure very rapidly that the language of the bill meets that objective. And so, my lords, I ask your lordships to rest on the long contested principle that this country's future should rest with Parliament and not with ministers. And it is in that spirit that I commend this new clause to your Lordship's House.
My Lords, I think it's the occasion for the Labour benches. My Lords, can I start by reminding this House that the Supreme Court gave us the benefit of their wisdom on constitutional matters in the case that we've heard about, the case of Gina Miller. And in that case, the Supreme Court's principal conclusion was that primary legislation is required to authorise the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. So I want to make it very clear that this bill is a notification bill. It is not an authorisation bill. It does not authorise withdrawal from the European Union. What it does is it notifies other European Union members that we are in a process of negotiation and the withdrawal must come back before this Parliament. And I want to remind the House what the Supreme Court judges said. They said that the reason why this was a matter for Parliament, both notification and finally withdrawal, was because any fundamental change to our laws that inevitably amend or abrogate our individual rights require the approval of Parliament. That is one of the essential constitutional principles under which our system operates. That anything involving our rights, whether it's to trade, whether it's to live, to travel under the European Union, we've introduced those into domestic law. Therefore, because it involves the rights of citizens, Parliament is the place that has to make the decision and approve any changes to that. Now, the concern that I raised at the committee stage late at night when most people were no longer here was that I'd heard repeatedly from ministers that if there wasn't a deal, or if Parliament decided that the deal was not good enough, we would walk away. And that therefore there was authorization from the people, having taken part in the referendum, to walk away. And I think that flies in the face of what was being said by the Constitutional Court of this country, the Supreme Court, dealing with constitutional issues. Because walking away and embarking on an engagement in trade worldwide under the WTO rules also involves an amendment, an abrogation of some of the rights that citizens in this country have. It has implications. And that's why it's a constitutional matter. And that's why this House particularly has a role to play.
I'm very grateful to the Baroness for giving way, but perhaps I could remind her of the limits of what the Supreme Court decided. In paragraph 3, they said it is worth emphasising that this case has nothing to do with the issues, such as the wisdom of the decision to withdraw from the European Union, the terms of withdrawal, the timetable or arrangements of withdrawal, or the details of any future relationship with the European Union. So there is a distinct limit to what they decided. Would the noble Baroness agree?
But in reaching their decision, they laid out the principle that the reason why they were in fact engaging with the case at all was not because they had a view on Brexit or not, but because of the constitutional principle. And the principle is a very straightforward one, which is that when it comes to our rights, Parliament is the place that you come to. Parliament makes those decisions. And that's why when it comes to the end, and we come and there's a deal on the table, then it has to be voted upon by Parliament. But if there's no deal, that too becomes an issue. And I'm afraid it's not good enough for ministers of government to say we just walk away as though it has no consequences. Walking away also has consequences for the rights of citizens in this country, and that's why it's a matter for Parliament. And so that's why this new clause is so important.
Lady Giveaway, she said at the beginning of her remarks that this is a notification bill, not an authorisation bill. Could she explain, therefore, what an authorisation amendment is doing in a notification bill?
The end of the process, there is going to be a need to come back before Parliament. That has been acknowledged by the Prime Minister and other ministers, and an undertaking, I understand, has been given. As the Viscount Hailsham has said, I believe that having it in statutory form is the best way for us to know exactly what is on offer. But I've heard repeatedly from ministers that the option of walking away involves no need for coming back before Parliament. I asked the question directly of the Minister, Lord Bridges, and I've heard it said by other ministers in select committee. So all I'm saying to this House is that is why this amendment is so important, and even important if no negotiation deal comes back before Parliament, because no deal means the WTO, and the WTO has implications for citizens of this country with regard to their rights.
My lords, as my noble friend Viscount Hailsham, whose father was a highly respected colleague of mine in government.
Did the noble lord finish? Because I was intervening on the noble lord's speech. Or have you finished?
Noble lady.
Noble lady.
I think that the noble Lord Finkelstein wanted to come in on the points that I was making. I actually had more or less completed, but if you want to raise an issue.
I'm sorry. Yeah, not doing this very well. Yeah. Wasn't the court's judgment based on the idea that this was authorisation? The court would not have ruled as it did if they hadn't assumed that this was not unilaterally revocable. Both sides in the court case, including the noble Lord Panic, said that it was not unilaterally revocable, and the court ruled specifically because of that authorisation was delivered by triggering Article 50, and if they had not done so, they wouldn't have ruled as they did. Therefore, it's absolutely crucial to the understanding that this is authorisation.
Notification of withdrawal, it is not a withdrawal bill.
My lords, as I was saying, as my noble friend Lord Hailsham, whose father I greatly respected as a colleague of mine in government, has reminded us the reason we're debating this new clause today is that the noble Lord Panic, who moved this amendment, convinced first the High Court and subsequently the majority of the Supreme Court that a bill was needed, and the government's intention to rely on the prerogative wouldn't do. His argument was clear, and I think it's helpful if I remind the House by quoting his words before the High Court. My case is very simple. My case is that notification is the pulling of the trigger, and once you have pulled the trigger, the consequence follows. The bullet hits the target. It hits the target on the date specified in Article 50, brackets 3, close brackets. The triggering leads to the consequence, inevitably leads to the consequence, as a matter of law, that the treaties no longer cease to apply. In short, the very act of invoking Article 50 inexorably leads to Brexit 2 years later. And this was the principal basis on which the courts decided that the government was wrong to rely on the prerogative. And yet, my lords, the new clause that we are now debating appears to be saying exactly the opposite. It is saying that there's no inevitability at all. Triggering Article 50 does not inevitably, to use Lord Panic's own word, lead to Brexit. For the explicit purpose of the clause is to ensure that even when Article 50 has been invoked, if Parliament disapproves of the outcome of the negotiations, it can stop Brexit happening. Indeed, as has been pointed out by a number of speakers in this debate, on the strict interpretation of the clause, your Lordship's House alone can prevent Brexit, since the approval of both houses is required. Now, I don't want to go down that avenue, because I have not time. But now I have the greatest respect for the noble Lord Panic as an exceedingly clever lawyer who deploys his cleverness with considerable charm. But is it possible for even him to have his cake and eat it too? Might this not be too clever by half? Yeah. But the real mischief, I would like to develop my argument, the real mischief in this new clause lies in subsection 4. Without subsection 4, there is a possible reconciliation with the original Panic thesis, as the noble lord himself effectively conceded. For in that event, Parliament would simply be faced with the decision of whether or not it approved the agreement the government had putatively reached with the European Union. Indeed, as the noble Lord Hope and one or two others have already pointed out, the government has pledged to put this before Parliament when the time comes. The government might, for example, have agreed to pay the Barnier ransom demand, which our own European Affairs Committee has recently confirmed we are under no legal obligation to pay, and in that case, Parliament might have found that unacceptable. But if, my lords, for whatever reason, Parliament refused to approve the agreement the government had reached with the EU, that would not prevent Brexit. It would simply mean that we left the European Union without an agreement. And as I explained during the course of the second reading of this bill, that is nothing to be scared about. So far from jumping off a non-existent cliff into the unknown, trading under WTO rules is the very satisfactory basis of most of the trade we do throughout the world today. And no agreement, yes, I give way.
I'm grateful. Will the noble Lord accept that the key question at this stage before the House this afternoon is who is to be master? Is it ministers or Parliament?
I think that if the noble Lord will allow me to develop my argument, he will see exactly what the problem with what he is saying is. As the Prime Minister, because no agreement is, in my opinion, far and away the most likely outcome. And as the Prime Minister made clear in her Exeter Lancaster House speech, and as the subsequent White Paper reiterated, no agreement would be better than a bad agreement. And sadly, it is sad, but sadly, a bad agreement is all that is likely to be on offer. But the mischief, my lords, of subsection 4 of this new clause is that it would not merely give Parliament the power to reject a bad deal, it would also enable Parliament to prevent Brexit altogether by refusing to allow the UK to leave the European Union without an agreement. This is not only in diametric opposition to the panic thesis on which the bill rests, more importantly, it would be an unconscionable rejection of the referendum result, which would drive a far greater wedge between the political class and the British people than the dangerous gulf that already exists. But it might be argued that all Parliament would be doing would be instructing the government to go back to Brussels and accept whatever agreement, however bad, the 27 are prepared to offer. But that is clearly unacceptable and indeed constitutionally improper. The only practical effect of subsection 4 would be to create a political crisis causing highly damaging uncertainty to business and the economy, and which could in practice be resolved only by a dissolution of Parliament and a general election. Something the opposition can always try to achieve, if that's what they wish, without this clause, simply by moving and carrying a vote of no confidence in the government. My lords, this mischievous new clause, masquerading as an assertion of parliamentary sovereignty, deserves to be rejected out of hand.
My lords.
I'm extremely grateful to my noble friend. No doubt she will have her opportunity in a moment. After more than 4 decades in which I sought to make the most modest of modest contributions to parliamentary effectiveness and reputation, I hope that my credentials as an advocate of parliamentary sovereignty will not be challenged. I'm very grateful to my noble friend Lord Panic, not only for his kind words, but also for his recasting of Amendment 3. I agree with him that if this amendment were to be made, the means of approval would be in the hands of the government. So I hope that he and noble lords will forgive me if I repeat some of the issues that, in that case, the government should have in mind. So far, ministerial language has been in terms of a vote and a motion. Now, that rather suggests proceeding by resolution. And if so, the concerns I expressed in committee are unallayed. What happens if one house votes one way, the other house votes the other way? Is a qualified approval, perhaps with some conditional rider, does that count as approval? Would it be acceptable in those circumstances to give this House an effective veto over the process? If, on the other hand, primary legislation is contemplated, the issue of interpreting some sort of qualified approval, or the terms of approval, remains. Even in the unloved Fixed-Term Parliaments Act, specific wording for a motion of confidence or no confidence was inserted to avoid the possibility of recourse to the courts. In matters of the present gravity, recourse to the courts would be even more unwelcome. My lords, my father had a ghastly warning about the dangers of over-specification in legislation, and he quoted what was alleged to have been a rule at the University of Heidelberg, which said, "No one shall tie anything, whether a night watchman or not a night watchman, to anything, whether a lightning conductor or not a lightning conductor, at any time, whether or not during a thunderstorm." I don't ask for that degree of specification. But if primary legislation is contemplated, then the terms of approval need to be considered very carefully indeed.
My Lord, I state to the House that I'm genuinely torn as to how to vote on this particular amendment. And may I turn to our very noble and very able friend, the Minister, to guide me in this respect. I listened very carefully to all the speakers this afternoon, particularly Baroness Kennedy, who I think comes from the same approach as I do. These amendments are based, to me, on a very simple proposition, that rights given to British subjects by statute can only be removed by statute. Of the two alternatives available, in particular Amendment 3, which I am tempted and minded to support, a resolution passed by both houses or a bill to be passed by both houses, the amendment neatly leaves to the government to determine the means to choose. I would argue, and I seek guidance from the Minister, and very powerful arguments against, why it would not be appropriate to include the amendment here on the face of this bill. And I say this because this is the last procedural stage before we embark on the substance, and we are told there will not just be the Great Repeal Bill, but a number of substantive primary pieces of legislation, as well as, no doubt, multiple secondary legislation to repeal some of the acquis that we may not wish no longer to apply. Why is it important to write it on the face of the bill? For so many reasons. Times change, politics change, personalities change. And I think we're being asked to take an awful lot on trust here, both in terms of a commitment from the government and a commitment given on the floor of the House of Commons that Parliament and the government would hope to follow through. Surely it is only right and proper that it should be put on the face of the bill. I would just like to remind the House that we spent about 2 hours, I think, and 30 minutes talking about the rights of EU nationals going forwards. If the referendum had been held on the same terms as European Parliament elections, all those EU nationals living here for the required length of time would have been enabled to vote. We, by an amendment, I understand that from memory, an amendment passed in this House deprived those 1 million EU nationals living in this country from the right to vote. So in fact, that 1 million number could have changed the outcome of the result of the referendum overnight. Now, I would refer to the words of the noble Lord Hope of Craighead in summing up his second reading, who expressed to the government in I thought, a very helpful way, that the Supreme Court's decision in Miller goes further than just this bill before us today, which embarks on the negotiation procedure. I don't think anybody in the House, or the majority of the House, would not wish to stand in the way of the triggering of the process. But by the same token, Lord Hope went on to say that by not writing into, I would argue, on the face of the bill, and I think also, I don't want to press him too hard, but I think Lord Hope was saying the same, that by obtaining approval by resolution in Parliament is not the same thing as being given statutory authority, and that is why he cautioned the government against thinking that this bill before the House today on its own will give the government all the authority they need, or that obtaining approval for an agreement by resolution is the same thing as being given statutory authority to conclude that agreement. I would just refer to an article that has been written by 5 eminent QCs who gave an opinion on this matter. I'll just quote one paragraph that said, "Meaningful parliamentary decision-making cannot be achieved by Parliament authorising exit from the European Union 2 years in advance on as yet unknown terms. Equally, it cannot be achieved by a single take-it-or-leave-it vote at the end of the process." And that argument, the whole article, based, as I say, 3 nights so, but 5 very eminent QCs, argue very straightforwardly the constitutional requirements for a decision by the United Kingdom to leave the European Union include the enactment of primary legislation consenting to give legal effect to the terms of a withdrawal agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union. So, in fact, rather than being a wrecking amendment, I see this amendment as being potentially helpful to the government as preventing a situation that we found ourselves in, having lost now 3 to 6 months through a court case and then an appeal, by actually writing onto the face of the bill that Parliament will have the final say, these two houses, and it will be the government's choosing what the mechanism, whether it should be a resolution of both houses or an act of Parliament, what that should be. But otherwise, there will be complete lack of clarity as to what the remaining rights, which have been already extended to British subjects, can continue to rely. And I go further, when we come to the Great Reform Bill, there will be a complete lack of clarity as to what the court on which we should rely to make sure that those outstanding rights can be enforced.
I think we'll hear from the noble lady, Baroness Deach, and then after that from the noble lady Simons, and then from my learned friend Lord Mackay.
My Lords, I wish to say a few brief, sad words about sovereignty and the likely outcome if Parliament disapproves the deal in the end of the negotiations in 2 years' time. The sad fact is that because of the construction of Article 50, we will not recover our parliamentary sovereignty in European matters until the whole process is over. If you contemplate what might happen in 2 years' time, we will see only too sadly that sovereignty lies with Europe. If this House or the other House were to reject the deal, we will end up as puppets in their hands. Can it honestly be imagined that if one or other House, whether it's approval or an Act of Parliament, goes back to Europe in just under 2 years' time and says, we don't like the deal, that the other 27 will say, oh dear, here is a much better one. Or that they will say, let us all 27 now agree to extend the negotiation time. I don't think that's the case. The noble Lord Oates indicated he did not trust the Prime Minister. I'm sorry to say I don't trust the other 27 members of the European Union to give us a good deal, or indeed to care very much about what happens to us or our nationals, because their only declared intent since last June has been, you must be punished, the Union must survive no matter what the cost. We will not accommodate you, we will not be kind to you. There is no vision, there is no mission.
Who said that?
My Lords, I read it in the papers every day. Now, this particular...
Perhaps the noble Baroness would quote to Lord Lee Executive what President Hollande said. He said, there has to be a price, there has to be a threat, there has to be a cost.
Thank you. Now, much of our argument turns on whether Article 50 is revocable or not. The Supreme Court judgment in Miller did not go that far. The judgment was based on the fact that the triggering of Article 50 would inevitably be the turning back moment at which the 2 years would start to run and would inevitably run its course. Indeed, I know there has been a legal opinion from 3 knights that Article 50 is revocable, but I know from my dealings with lawyers that you can find another 3 knights who will tell you something quite different. And although I've heard it said that the noble Lord Kerr drafted the article and he knows what it's about, again, in our system, it is not the draftsman who in the end declares what the article means. It is the fact that if parliamentary approval were needed at the end of the deal, what might it look like? Some parts of it might very well deal with European nationals. Only a few days ago, we were expressing our shock and dismay that the position of European nationals might not be taken care of. Would we be throwing them all into disarray in 2 years' time if, amongst probably thousands of pages of deal, there was something about European nationals? I'm sorry to say that the noble Lord, Lord Panic, has departed from his usual clarity in legal matters. I think he's tied himself and the House in knots. Because, on the one hand, he says, we always defer in the end to the Commons. I wonder if we will hear that this evening or next week, if there is a head-on clash between our decision, if we go for the amendment, and what the House of Commons says. On the other hand, he's also said that approval is better than having an Act of Parliament. It leaves it open to the Prime Minister to decide what to do. But with an Act of Parliament expressing what is in this amendment, the Commons would prevail because of the Parliament Acts. In other words, you can't really have it both ways. The only other possible outcome at the end is no deal, the 2-year shutter comes down, we're off the cliff, or there's a general outcome, and others know just as well how difficult that would be. Our lack of sovereignty means this: if at the end of 2 years the rest of the European Union does not give us what we want, and either house rejects that deal, the European Union will for sure not welcome us back with open arms, not necessarily accept a revocation of Article 50, and not necessarily give us a better deal. That is the reality of the situation. We will have to take what comes our way in 2 years' time. Plainly, the amendments requiring a second parliamentary assent are designed to enable Brexit to be blocked in the mistaken belief that the EU will roll over. Because if this is enacted, it is simply more likely to lead to no deal at all. In practice, it is unworkable and defies the result of the referendum. The referendum was on a matter of principle, not details. It is deep lying with many of those who voted to leave, regardless of the details. They want to separate themselves from the European Union, and it is very unlikely that they will feel differently in 2 years, especially if the Union deals up a bad deal to the rest of us. I oppose the amendment.
Well, my Lords, I don't know what people will feel like in 2 years' time. We know that the demographics would have changed. We know that the young people will be coming onto the electoral register. And as we all know, young people have taken a very different view about our leaving the EU to that which the older people have taken, who will no longer be able to vote. But, my Lords, what I wanted to do, if I may, is to ask the Minister on 2 very specific points. In view of what the noble Lord Lawson had to say about the Supreme Court judgment that Article 50 was irrevocable, a view just reiterated by the noble Lady Deach, I did think that the Supreme Court judgment was rather more nuanced than that. That the Supreme Court judgment actually said that because the parties to the action were prepared to use that as the basis for forming their judgment, that they had not tested the arguments about the irrevocability or otherwise of Article 50. So there was a quite clear statement that they had not tested that argument. Now, in second reading, I asked the noble Lord what the government's views were on this. And the noble Lord, in, I have to say, a very, very skilled response that he gave at the end of that debate, said that it was the firm policy of the government not to turn back on once having triggered. Now, the noble Lord knows that was not the question asked. I did not ask, we are not asking about the firm policy. What we need to know is what is the government's legal view on the revocability or otherwise of Article 50. It is a crucial question. It is a crucial question because if this issue does come back to Parliament, we will be in a very different position if it is revocable. So I ask the question, my Lords, and I hope that this time I might have the answer. My Lords, the second point I want to ask the Minister about is the position whereby the government has sought to bypass Parliament, as indeed it did, by saying that the prerogative powers were sufficient to trigger Article 50. My Lord, it did indeed take private individuals, represented by the noble Lord Panic, to go to court to prevent the government going beyond its powers. Beyond its powers. and to bypass this Parliament. The government had assumed it had powers by using the prerogative, and the Supreme Court were able to disabuse the government of that point. Now, my lords, in claiming that...
Doesn't overlay accept that the reason the court made that judgment was because both parties had agreed that it wasn't unilaterally revocable. That's why. That is the base. That is the reason why. That is the reason why both parties had to agree to that, because otherwise the court would have ruled differently. They ruled that this was a parliamentary decision of authorisation. That is the reason why it had to come back to Parliament, because it would change law.
The point that the Supreme Court made was it had not tested the point about revocability, and I would say to the noble lord that if it were to be asked to do that, who knows what would be there. I've given way once, my lords, and the noble lord has had his chance to speak already, so perhaps he'll allow me to continue with my modest intervention. My lords, the political position now is that the Supreme Court has not made that judgment, and it took going to Parliament, going to the court, in order to get the views that we have. My lords, when we get to the end of this whole intervention, I wonder what the noble Lord Minister is going to be able to say about our ability to trust the views of ministers. I'm not saying that we don't believe that ministers really want to come back to Parliament, but the only assurance we are going to have is by putting this on the face of the bill. My lords, the government has not got good form over this. They have not got good form. They went to the Supreme Court after the High Court had told them what the judgment should be, and they foolishly went on, in my view. So we need this on the face of the bill because, as I say, the government has form of bypassing Parliament, and we need to know that that will not happen again. My lords, we need the best legal checks and balances that we can get. Not to stop Brexit, my lords, not to stop Brexit, but to make sure that we obtain from Brexit the best this country can get. And that's why we need to vote for this amendment today. It's why, too, this amendment, if it's successful in this House, I hope goes on to be successful in another place. Because Britain relies on parliamentary sovereignty. And now is the moment, my lords, for our parliamentary sovereignty to be fully asserted and asserted by this House. Not in 6 months' time, my lord, not in 18 months, not at the end of the period of negotiation. But we have to make sure, legally, that Britain's best interests are protected and safeguarded. That is the job of this Parliament. It's our job here today, and I urge this House to vote for this amendment.
My lords, I might first of all take up the point that the noble lady has just mentioned from the judgment of the Supreme Court, because naturally I have studied it with a certain amount of care. It was agreed as the basis from both sides, the government side and the applicant side, that they should treat the Article 50 notification as irrevocable. But Lord Reid pointed out clearly that that had not been the subject of decision by the court, but that for the point of view of the judgment, it didn't matter so long as it was possible that it was irrevocable. Because if that was the case, the danger to acts of Parliament was existing. Even if it turned out that it might be revocable, if it was possible that it was not revocable, then once the thing was triggered, these acts of Parliament came into danger. So it was as simple as that. And I think that we must assume, I'm prepared anyway to assume, that the government lawyers took the view that Article 50 notification was irrevocable because it's on that basis they took the case. And of course, some doubt about that might have helped them if they thought there was a real argument that it was revocable. Then the bullet and all the rest of it that Lord Pannick was talking about in the decision would maybe not have occurred. So the government lawyers definitely took the view, I think, that it was irrevocable. Anyway, the point tonight is a different one. The Prime Minister and the Minister in the Commons both gave an undertaking that a motion would be put before both Houses of Parliament for approval of the final deal. And there are other, also for the way in which we might leave the European Union. They both gave that undertaking, but they did not say that the Prime Minister would necessarily be bound by the decision of both houses. Now, the difficulty in this amendment, as I see it, is that it does require formally the approval of both houses. There's no question, that's as clear as it can be. I am not a prophet, and I don't claim to be, and so exactly what will happen after 2 years, I don't know. All I know is that I feel absolutely certain that the negotiations will be quite difficult, and that it will be very difficult at this stage to tell what sort of outcome we may get. If we can get such an agreement in relation to economics, as the Prime Minister indicated in her speech, then that might be very good. On the other hand, some people who know more than I do about it think that may not be very likely. Anyway, as I said, I don't know what's going to happen. The Prime Minister and the Minister have agreed that both Houses of Parliament should have a motion put before them for approval. But neither of them said, and I believe that that may be the reason why they phrased it as they did, neither of them said that the approval of both houses would be necessary. Now, my lords, I want to point out the danger of not getting this right, and I see no reason why it shouldn't be put right if people are agreed that it isn't quite right, and that the House of Commons should be the prime source of authority on this matter. Because your lordships will remember, if you read the newspapers, and I'm sure most of us do, and perhaps some selective newspapers, but most of us do, the suggestion that this was all a scheme for this House trying to defeat the Brexit vote. And I don't want it to be said unnecessarily in any circumstances that we give colour to that, because I feel certain, I feel absolutely certain that nobody in this House wants to engineer a blockage of the Brexit vote as the Prime Minister goes ahead. I feel sure of that, and I think I'm right. We were told this morning, somebody talked about the tribal appearance. I don't feel myself as part of any particular tribe, but I do feel clear that I want the matter to be right. If it's sent back, if this amendment is sent back to the Commons, I would like it to be correct, so that nobody could suggest that we were trying a scheme which might block Brexit because we refuse our approval and the House of Commons approves it.
The learned Lord, but as I understand his speech, what he is saying is that provided that the primacy of the House of Commons is made clear, he would support the amendment. Is that right?
Yes. Well, what I'm saying is that I think it would then simply incorporate the Prime Minister and the Minister's undertaking.
Not subsection 4.
Of course, there's the bit about at the end. That's a separate matter. On the whole, I don't feel very inclined to get into it, because there is the problem that, as it was said, the Brexit business, once it's initiated, may go out of hand. You know, it may terminate without any voluntary agreement on the part of the Prime Minister. And the amendment doesn't really deal with that. But I don't see too much harm in that particular amendment. As I said, I can't foresee exactly what's going to happen. And I would sincerely hope that it's the first two branches of the first two branches of the amendment that come into play in the end, and that there is an agreement that can be put before the Houses of Parliament. But as I said, nobody knows. I can't tell, and we can only hope. But I think it would be very desirable for any amendment of this kind going from this House to recognise the supremacy of the House of Commons.
My Lords, I think it's this side.
Two quick points. First,
I think my noble friend will find that, unfortunately, my noble and learned friend has sat down. There will be an opportunity for him to speak, but I did indicate earlier that I thought we should hear from the Lord Kerr at this stage.
I'm grateful to the noble Lord. Two quick points. First, by way of clarification on the issue of revocability raised by Lord Finkelstein. I'm very glad that he raised it. We discussed it extensively at second reading, and he told his readers in the Times that we didn't mention it at all. So I'm very glad that he's here this time. When Lord Panic, and I pay tribute to his skill both in court and here, when Lord Panic won his case in the High Court, not the Supreme Court, and the number 10 spokesman was asked about revocability, the spokesman said, as a matter of firm policy, our notification to withdraw will not be withdrawn. At second reading, after our extensive debate, the Minister put on the spot by the Baroness Simons of Vernon Dean, was it revocable or not revocable? Very clever man, the Minister. He replied, as a matter of firm policy, our notification will not be withdrawn. Very similar to the number 10 spokesman, always wise in a minister. In committee, when the same issue of revocability was raised, the Minister said, last Wednesday, replying to the debate on the amendment, as a matter of policy, we will not withdraw our notice to leave. The wording's slightly wrong there, but I'm sure they'll forgive it. My Lords, when the government say that as a matter of policy, firm or infirm, they will not withdraw the notification which this bill authorises, the government every time implicitly confirm that in law they could withdraw it. And they could. If you want a definitive source, don't look at me, listen to the President of the European Council, who has said so on the record. If you want a definitive EU legal view, and this would be an EU legal question if it was ever tested, try the present head of the Council Legal Service or the head of the Council Legal Service who advised me when I was writing the wretched thing. It is irrevocable. Just a point of clarification. Second point, in relation to the discussion, particularly the noble Lord Lawson's discussion, of the last section, section 4 of Lord Panic's amendment, in which he detected deep evil. It seems to me that what is being said there is that the decision that no deal is better than a bad deal is a decision for Parliament. It seems to me what's being said there is that the judgment on whether the bad deal is a bad deal and the chaos and disruption of leaving with no deal preferable, I find it very hard. I struggle to think of the deal which could be worse than no deal. And I note that the president of the CBI last week said that the worst possible scenario was leaving with no deal. But that's not the point. The point is about parliamentary sovereignty. The issue of whether no deal is worse than this deal, the deal that is available on the table on that day, is for Parliament to decide, and that's what Section 4 of the amendment says, and I support it.
Yeah. My Lords, Lord Kerr quite rightly and always entertainingly referred to the crucial element of parliamentary sovereignty. We've heard from top lawyers and top diplomats, and I only offer some thoughts as a run-of-the-mill parliamentarian. But I do think that the phrase parliamentary sovereignty is something which I couldn't possibly vote against. For me to vote against a motion like this would have an element of being voting against motherhood and apple pie. It's something which I believe in passionately. It's something which was one of the reasons why many people, and I was one of them, was concerned about during the course of the European referendum, because it seemed to me to be incontrovertible that the way in which the European Union had developed involved a steady erosion of parliamentary sovereignty. And I think it would be quite difficult to disagree with that proposition. However, we come to, and have to, when addressing this amendment, what a decision by Parliament actually comprises. And I'm forced to read the amendment as it's written down here. Subsection 1 refers to without the approval of both Houses of Parliament. Subsection 3 requires the prior approval of both Houses of Parliament. Subsection 4 refers to the prior approval of both Houses of Parliament. Now, to propose this amendment, and I say it with great respect to the weight of legal opinion that's being offered, to propose it without being clear about what's involved in the approval of both Houses of Parliament is to leave an ambiguity at the heart of this amendment, which really hardly needs adding to what Lord Mackay has already said. And if I could I felt concerned about this from the start. I raised it at committee stage. There's been an attempt to move towards the answering of the question, what happens if the Commons says yes and the Lord says no? But the solution to it is certainly not contained within these amendments. Now, I did make an admittedly inadequate attempt with the Public Bill Office to see if there was any way in which I could put down an amendment which would satisfy or at least address this problem which I see at the heart of the bill. And if the House will forgive me, because I shall conclude very shortly after this, I will just read out the terms of the defunct amendment, at least as of now. It would have said this: if, under the provisions of subsection 1, 3 or 4, there is a disagreement between the House of Commons and the House of Lords as to whether or not the agreement or decision should be approved, the view of the House of Commons prevails over the view of the House of Lords. Now that, for me, makes an attempt to explain precisely, or resolve, I hope, precisely, the ambiguity at the heart of this bill.
I was following the Noble Lord's argument opposite, which I agree with in terms of imprecision and indeed of the lack of clarity on what happens if both houses disagree. But would he agree with me that there is a further issue in relation to the different procedures of the two houses? In the House of Commons, the government controls the agenda. We heard from the Noble Lord panic, oh, well, it will be up to the government what happens in this House. But am I not right in saying that any Noble Lord can put down an amendment to disapprove at any time a resolution which this House votes on? So in this House, it surely can't be in any circumstances in the control of the government what might constitute approval or disapproval. Isn't that a further difficulty with the amendment?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, I can understand that point, but I really do want to just emphasise the central problem which Lord Mackay's identified, and to really ask the House, or perhaps more specifically ask the proposer of the motion, whether something like that included at third reading would solve the difficulty which I think he would even acknowledge was expressed in the various interventions that he dealt with. But I will say one thing that is to some degree with my capacity to influence, to my own front bench and to my very good noble friend Baroness Hayter, who will be winding up, that this is something which is actually, if not within the control of the House, it's within the control of my beloved Labour Party, which for as long as I've been in it has been absolutely clear about the primacy of the elected House over the unelected House, that should we find ourselves in a situation after passing this amendment as it is written, should we find ourselves in a situation in 2 years' time where there is a clash between the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the normal tests of attempts at agreement and solution to the differences had all been attempted, that this party, at any rate, asserts quite clearly that ultimately the primacy of the House of Commons must prevail.
It's a great pleasure to follow the noble Lord Grocott, and I agree with very much of what he said.
I do apologise. There are a lot of people wanting to speak, and I've tried to construct a sort of speaking order, and I suggest that my noble friend Lord Howard speaks at this stage. I see that the noble Baroness Lady Jones also wants to speak, and I think it might be sensible then. Yes, indeed. I will let Lord Higgins speak next, and I will indeed include Lady Altman in the list later.
I'm grateful to my noble friend. My lords, I long ago came to the painful recognition that many members of your lordship's house think that to serve in this place without having served down the corridor in the other place was an absolutely enormous advantage. So it is with some temerity that I seek to draw on my experience in the other place, 27 years, not as long as my noble friend Lord Heseltine, to make a preliminary observation. At the end of the negotiations, there will either be an agreement or a decision by the government to leave the European Union without an agreement. And whichever of those scenarios comes about, the other place will have its say. And the other place will not only have its say, the other place will have its way. If the agreement that is reached by the government is unacceptable to a majority of the members of the House of Commons, they will vote accordingly. And if the government proposes to leave the European Union on terms which are unacceptable to a majority of the members of the House of Commons, they will vote accordingly. And they don't need the authority of Mr. David Jones for that. They don't even need the authority of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for that. And they certainly don't need this new clause for that. They don't need any authority of that. They will have their say, they will have their way. And for those of us who believe that parliamentary supremacy rests with the House of Commons, that is the ultimate safeguard. Now, I want to make a couple of observations about the new clause. I think the noble Lord Panic, in the end, really admitted, not quite explicitly, but in effect admitted, that it does provide, in its present form at any rate, a veto for your lordship's house. He said it was extremely unlikely that your lordships would exercise that veto, and in the end, he was obliged to accept a lifeline from my noble friend Viscount Hailsham,
But as is so often the case, when you examine a lifeline in detail, it proves not to be quite as effective as at first sight it appeared. The lifeline offered by my noble friend was that the government might enshrine the necessary motions necessary by virtue of this new clause, in an Act of Parliament, so that the Parliament Act could be activated. I ask your lordships to consider that situation. The government will have agreed the terms on which it's going to leave the European Union. The House of Commons will have approved those terms, but this House will have rejected them, and we have to hang around for a year until the Parliament Act can be used to ensure that the House of Commons gets its way. That was suggested by my noble friend, the Viscount Horsham. Now, even my noble friend, Lord Heseltine, acknowledged the need for the minimum of delay. We all want the minimum of delay. And the notion, my lords, that the nation should stand around for a year waiting for the Parliament Act to be invoked for the House of Commons to get its way illustrates how unnecessary this amendment and this new clause is. And I want to make one other general point on the new clause. Of course, if we put the requirement for approval by this House and by the other House and so on the face of the statute, if we put it on the statute book, then it becomes justiciable. I have long ago given up any attempt to anticipate the ingenuity of the arguments which the noble Lord Panic is able to deploy when he gets into the courts. But just think of the potential which would exist for arguing that the motion that had been approved by one House or the other didn't quite match up to this interpretation or that of the new clause, which would be on the face of the statute. The noble Lord Lisvane said he thought further intervention by the courts would be unhelpful. I couldn't agree more. That's not a sentiment which may not be shared by all your lordships. I suspect it won't be shared by the noble Lord Panic. But I think it has much to commend it. I don't think we should lightly embark upon a course which would not only run the risk of putting one House in conflict with another, but of putting Parliament in conflict with the courts. And just finally, before I sit down, my lords, new clause 4. I agree with what my noble friend Lord Lawson said about that, and without repeating everything I said last week, we have still not yet had an answer to the fact that sub-clause 4 of the new clause would facilitate repeated coming and going between Parliament, government, and the European Union. The government would come along and say, we haven't done a deal, we propose to leave. Parliament, according to sub-clause 4, could say, go back to the table, and that could happen again and again, and it would be an absurd position to put our government in. So, my lords, first of all, for the reasons that I've tried to express, I think this new clause is totally unnecessary. Secondly, I think it is a recipe for conflict between this House and the other place, and for conflict between Parliament and the courts. And I urge your lordships to reject it.
Yeah. My lords, it's an honour to follow the noble Lord Howard.
I'm sorry, I did indicate that I was going to call the noble lady, Baroness Jones. I will indeed. I'm trying to compile a speakers list. I hope people understand that's a reasonable way of carrying on, seeing so many people have indicated to me that they wish to contribute to this debate.
It's an honour to follow the noble Lord Howard, with whom I did share a platform during the referendum campaign. But on this, I'm afraid I have to disagree with him. I rise to support Amendment 3. I think there is a lot of merit in Amendment 4, but it seems the House is probably going to go for something written by lawyers, because apparently some of us do still trust lawyers, which I think is sometimes a good move. I think that I am going to be brief. I'm going to be to the point as well. And I'm taking a rather simplistic attitude to this whole debate. I feel that during the referendum, we did vote for taking back control. It seems to me that taking back control does not mean giving such a momentous decision for the future of the UK to a tiny cohort of politicians. As we've said, the government, the Prime Minister, did commit themselves to a vote in both houses. They must have thought that was an appropriate thing to do, and therefore I see no problem at all with a commitment from this House. The fact is, people change, governments change, so we can't really be sure that the same people will be in power at the time that this is actually finally happening. So I think it's very important that we do get a commitment. Parliament has to have scrutiny of this. It has to have a say on something that's so incredibly important. A deal that's being thrashed out between the UK and the EU that's going to affect our futures forever. I also think it's a mockery if the European Parliament gets a vote on this and we don't. That, again, is not taking back control. Now, one of the other commitments during the referendum was, of course, the $350 billion to the NHS. I do look forward to the budget tomorrow and seeing that as a budget line, because, quite honestly, that was one of the things I voted for when I voted leave.
My Lords, thank you. My Lords, I sought to intervene earlier far more aggressively than I would ever normally do, simply because I wish to pursue the point made by my noble friend Lord Mackay and Lord Grocott, and I think it is of a very considerable tactical importance in relation to the debate which we are having. I think there is very widespread agreement that there should be parliamentary approval for the outcome of the negotiations. And the Prime Minister herself has actually made it clear that she believes that should be so. And the noble Lord Panic has sought to incorporate that undertaking on the face of the bill, which again, I believe, is the right thing to do. The problem, however, is in the drafting of the Lord Panic's amendment. And in opening the debate, he said, well, he realised there were problems because it seemed to give a veto to the House of Lords, which I think would not be acceptable. And in particular, also, it failed to recognise the relationship between the two houses, whereby the House of Commons must, at the end of the day, be supreme. He suggested that we should agree to the amendment, which is before us, and then, of course, the House of Commons would sort it out. I think there is a problem with that. It is a very simple problem. People are less likely to vote for his amendment on that basis than would otherwise be the case. And therefore it may never get to the House of Commons, and they will not be able to put the matter right. So we have a very difficult situation as we now stand as to whether or not we should support the amendment. My inclination is still to do so because subject to what may be said subsequently, because I think it is important to get the undertaking on the face of the bill, but we have to resolve the problem of ensuring that the House of Commons remains supreme and that we cannot have a veto over what's been negotiated, be wholly inappropriate if the House of Commons took the opposite view. And therefore, the one possible solution is to try and draft a manuscript amendment, or to amend the bill at some later stage in the proceedings. I fear that may be very difficult, though perhaps we might try. But at all events, in any case, I think that we should probably agree to the amendment, but I understand many people would feel it is defective in the respect which was mentioned. And then it would be very unfortunate if we don't have anything as a result of these debates which will ensure that the undertaking given by the Prime Minister is absolutely clear, is on the face of the bill, and there's no uncertainty about the situation in the future.
My Lords,
My Lords, I would like to preface my remarks by expressing my belief that speaking in favour of any amendment to this bill does not amount to trying to frustrate the referendum result or to deny the will of the people. I respect the result, and we are trying to implement it as responsibly as we can in the interests of our great country. The referendum was about taking back control and ensuring parliamentary sovereignty. That is vital to safeguard our democracy and protect our national interests. The people want to be able to trust our Parliament to look after their future. But in the context of this bill, it seems to me that Parliament is in danger of abrogating its responsibility. I have heard the arguments which suggest that parliamentary oversight somehow makes it inevitable that the EU will only offer us a bad deal. However, I respectfully disagree. Indeed, I believe the likelihood is the other way round. If the negotiators and ministers know that at the end of the day they will have to sell this deal to Parliament, then I believe they will be properly incentivised to be more likely to achieve a deal that is acceptable. As currently proposed, this bill will effectively hand responsibility for our future to a group of negotiators and ministers who apparently countenance with a measure of equanimity the idea that no deal is better than a bad deal. If we enter negotiations with a view that the EU will not give us a good deal and that we will just have to leave the single market, the customs union, Euratom, and so many other fundamental parts of our current economic security, then we must surely ask ourselves whether those negotiators will be sufficiently incentivised to actually get a good deal for the country. My Lords, a no-deal scenario was never put to the British people. The White Paper and the referendum campaign have not considered the consequences either. Leaving the customs union, single market and Euratom are recent decisions with significant implications for people's jobs, for standards of living, for national security, for the nuclear industry, for Northern Ireland and so much else. Yet the risks have been skirted over, almost as if they do not really matter. But, my Lords, they do matter. In normal negotiations, corporate negotiators would reserve the option of taking an offer back to their board, or a lawyer to refer back to their client.
With my noble friend, I'm grateful to her allowing me to intervene. Would she explain how what she's saying now squares with what she said at the start of her speech about not challenging the result of the referendum?
I am not challenging the result of the referendum. We are here to debate and discuss how best to safeguard the interests of our country and what might happen at the end of the negotiations, and in light of the referendum to make sure that we have parliamentary sovereignty. And that is what this debate and this amendment is about. Why would we deny Parliament, the heart of our democracy, the authority to approve or push for a better deal rather than accepting no deal without a proper say? This parliamentary route, giving Parliament and not the executive a meaningful final vote, is my preferred option, not a referendum. Such a safety net written into statute would seem to me to be the most responsible course to take as we negotiate our EU exit. And I believe it is my duty, given the very serious concerns that I have expressed, to ask the other place to reconsider the need for elected MPs to take responsibility for the future of their constituents. I do believe they must have the final say on this bill, and I would like to ask them to think again.
To this debate with a question that was unanswered at the beginning and to me is still unanswered, and it's this. The proposed Amendment 3.3 reads, the prior approval of both Houses of Parliament shall also be required in relation to an agreement for the future relations of the United Kingdom. And 4, the prior approval of both Houses of Parliament shall also be required in relation to any decision by the Prime Minister that the United Kingdom shall leave. Well, assume the House of Commons and the House of Lords are in agreement. They say, we don't approve of the terms of the agreement. We don't approve that the Prime Minister shall decide that we leave without an agreement. My question is, what then? Is it implicit in this amendment that Parliament may then decide to withdraw the Article 50 notification?
My Lords, whether Article 50's notification is irrevocable as a matter of policy or law, I believe that we could only interrupt the process of leaving the EU by another referendum. I think this is the point that Lord Lawson touched upon. And in fact, the beginning of Baroness Altman's speech also made the same point. If we were to get into a situation in 2 years' time where Parliament was seen to be blocking the departure of the United Kingdom from the European Union without another referendum, I think there would be a serious political situation in our country. And I think that while we've talked in our debates this afternoon about conflicts between the Executive and Parliament, between the Executive and the law, between the two houses, I do rather agree with Lord Grocott that as it stands, really, it should be the House of Commons that should have the decisive vote. But to me, there's a real potential for conflict with the outcome of a referendum. We decided to have the referendum. And it seems to me we could only put that into reverse with another referendum, which this morning, in a sense, we decided we didn't want to do. I do admire the Liberal Democrats who are consistent on this point, and they have their amendment down at third reading, I noticed. But at the end of the day, we could in 2 years' time be in a very serious, difficult and sensitive political situation. And I'm not sure putting this clause into the bill will actually help the handling of that political situation. The Prime Minister and the Minister in the other place have given a solemn undertaking, a public undertaking, that there will be parliamentary support, approval for whatever is proposed. And I do think that can be trusted. And I just wonder what the advantage is of setting this down. And particularly in subclause 4, the thought that Parliament will block the Article 50 process without going back to the people. Now, it was only 52-48, and that's another conflict that we're handling in this whole discussion, and I accept that. But it seems to me in our debates we're not facing up to the fundamental fact of the referendum itself.
My Lords, I apologise for not being present for second reading. My Lords, and in doing so...
My Lords, not for the first time, I wholly agree with the analysis of my noble friend Lord Heseltine. I think we entered the House of Commons on the same day over 50 years ago. So I agree with his analysis, but I'm afraid I don't agree with his conclusion. What amendments are clearly trying to do, with great sincerity, and I appreciate all that they're aiming for, and all their concerns, they are trying to impose statutory precision on the face of a bill which happens to be going through this House on a very uncertain future and on events which are completely unforeseen. As my noble friend Lord Heseltine said, and others have said in their speeches, we have absolutely no grasp and no idea of where the world will be or where this issue will be in 2 years' time. We don't know, starting the other side of the channel, any commentary shows clearly that uncertainty as to who is taking the lead is daily. There are quarrels between the national capitals and Brussels. There are infighting arrangements inside the European Commission. The Visegrad Four are already talking about a different treaty. The last hour, we've seen a blog saying that Spain and Poland want to join together on a completely different approach to the negotiations from the approach being offered by the European Commission. So uncertainty it is, and
there's an additional point, which the noble Lord Kerr made with his usual eloquence, that this can be, in certain circumstances, almost inconceivable, except under completely different government this side of the Channel, that the whole project can be aborted and withdrawn. The truth, which my noble friend Lord Howard stated with great frankness and eloquence, is that in the Commons, the parliamentary majority can do what it likes. And when I say the majority, that's slightly different from this word parliament that flows from legal lips as though it's a sort of entity. Of course it isn't. Parliament is actually the people who are controlling the majority, the managers managing the parties or the coalitions who've got a majority in the Commons. That's what comes out at the end if you press the button, Parliament. My Lords, I say to noble Lord Tavern, whose speech I greatly enjoyed, that I'm certainly more, and indeed Lord Kerr, that I'm certainly more Burke than Brezhnev, but I'm also a disciple of Karl Popper. And Karl Popper spent a lot of time warning us, a lot of time, as did Isaiah Berlin and others, about the dangers of too much inevitability, too much determinism, the poverty of determinism he warned us against. So telling the Commons what to do by statute law now about a situation that may be completely different from anything we present envisage seems to me a noble but really, really futile project. Commons will decide by parliamentary real majority. It always has. Well, not always. There's been fights in past centuries, of course, against the royal prerogative. But since Parliament won that battle, as they did in our history, Parliament decides, and Parliament means the Parliament's majority, and the majority means as long as the managers can control a majority, and the whips can keep a majority in place, and it's big enough, then that is the will of Parliament. My Lords, if after 2 years some kind of bundle emerges, which would be divorce papers, mixture, and some new arrangements, it could be vastly complex, and I think it'll be actually have all sorts of uncompleted trails and uncompleted aspects to it. If after 2 years some sort of major document comes forward, which is the work after 2 years of ministers slaving away, of vast difficulties in negotiations, of private deals, of mutual equivalence, of mutually beneficial arrangements between sectors and industries, and heaven knows what else. If after all that there is then a vote in Parliament, and the government loses the vote, or the majority moves against it and fails to give approval, I don't see how there can be any doubt about what then happens. That is a declaration of no confidence. We have, I know, the 5-year rule. That would have to be changed. Well, actually, it wouldn't have to be changed if the no confidence was in ringing terms, as it almost certainly would be, and then we would arrive at a general election. That seemed so obvious and so certain that I cannot understand those who are talking mysteriously about a world beyond rejection, a world in which ministers are somehow, this is again inconceivable, ministers are sent back to Brussels saying, well, our Parliament has looked at this, they don't like it, we're carrying on. It wouldn't be the same ministers, it wouldn't be the same government, it wouldn't be the same deal. There would be a complete difference, regardless of what is written on any piece of paper, regardless of any statute beautifully drafted by all the learned people sitting around me and sitting on the other side. However beautiful the drafting, however firm the statute, it makes no difference in reality of what is actually going to happen. I don't want to stray beyond the confines of the report stage, but of course behind the longing, the concern to get this into a statute, to pin it down on the face of the bill, on the piece of paper, is a real concern, I realise. And it's a concern of those who fear that the deal, when it comes back, will not include our membership of the single market and will not include our membership of the customs union. That will brand it a bad deal, and that will lead a lot of people in the Commons, but I suspect not the majority, a lot of people to think about voting it down. They won't succeed, but they will think about it. I would just say this to my noble friends in this House. There is room for doubt, and I say this particularly to the noble Lord Kerr. There is room for considerable doubt as to whether being in or out of the single market as it exists today, in this ocean of digital change, with vast new supply chains travelling in every direction, with low tariffs and perforated tariff walls and perforated special arrangements and regulations on every side, and a completely new pattern of trade, different totally in character from even 10 years ago. There is a doubt as to whether being inside or outside the single market is really the end of the world, the catastrophe. The chairman of the chief economist of the Bank of England the other day, last week, was saying, Mr. Haldane was saying, actually, it doesn't matter. Actually, over the next 3 years, it's of no material difference to the growth of the British economy, whether it is in or out of the a single market. So I just put that in as an aside. I appreciate perfectly well that moves away from the amendment, but behind the amendment and behind the concerns is a genuine fear of the nature of the single market as being some kind of wall we're going to be excluded from. All I say is look at the facts. Look at the details of what is actually happening now, and we'll see that it's very different from what is being argued by those who say it will be a disaster, we were bound to pay a colossal price, trade halves in effectiveness at double the distance. All these sort of generalities belong to the past century and a world that no longer exists. So, my lords, the whole idea to me of sending ministers back to Brussels to get us into the single market again, if the deal was arranged outside, not only is clearly a fantasy, it doesn't, in reality, no such situation could ever arise, worthy of an animated cartoon, but highly disadvantageous. There is a new pattern emerging, a new world governed by the WTO, which many people feel has got all sorts of advantages which have been not discussed at all by this House. Hardly examined.
Part of the amendment.
Yes, I just want to finish by saying, so that for the House to tell the House of Commons, for this House, tell the House of Commons what to do 2 years hence in a completely different situation from anything we present envisage, is to make fools of ourselves twice over. If that's what your lordships want, or those opposite, so be it. But it would have to be without me. My hope, my lords, remains that we in this House can contribute not division, but unity to a very difficult challenge and a major new situation emerging for this country in the near future. That's what I hope for. But perhaps we can't deliver the unity in this amendment, but we can at least agree on the facts. And at the present, the full facts are not being presented to us.
My lords, my lords, I should remind noble lords that it is report stage, and we do not want second reading speeches. It is not appropriate that members should give second reading speeches. I apologise to my noble friend, but I'm afraid it is. Now, I'm afraid there's still some more people who have indicated that want to speak.
My lords, I'm just going to make a couple of simple points because I can see that the House is getting to the point where they're ready to hear from the front benches. But I wanted to pick up on a phrase that my noble friend Viscount Howsham used, although I disagreed with him and his amendment. But he talked about whether there's a price to pay. And I think what we have to reflect on as a House as well, that if we support these amendments, and particularly if we support an amendment which gives us power ultimately to overturn the referendum result, there is a price that comes with that too. Because I think, my lords, we have to decide what is most important to us. Is it that we want to influence the Prime Minister as she goes into these negotiations, or do we want to say now we want power to overturn that referendum result? And I feel, as I said, my lords, at committee stage, I feel very strongly that people in both these houses, this House and the other place, and policy makers outside and leading business, there's a lot of expertise and experience that needs to be heard by the Prime Minister, by the government over the next 2 years, and be influential in that negotiation period. And I worry, my lords, that we will start to undermine the case for or the right for us to be heard in that way. And I'll just say one final thing. The noble Lord Turner, referred to us as party politicians and referred to some of us as being tribal. It was something that somebody else mentioned this morning. I think we have to reflect very carefully on what has changed since the referendum and reflect more carefully on how we are seen by the electorate, because I don't think they see us in party terms in the same way that they used to. I think there's almost a very clear two set of politicians that people consider and listen to. One of those that they feel understand them. Let me finish this point, my lord. One of them is people who feel that they understand them. And the other group are people who they feel are against them. Now, my lords, I know that most of the people who are participating in these debates and working very hard to get the best result for this Brexit deal are not against the people. But we need to understand ourselves that they think that we are. And so we have to reflect what it is about us that we need to do differently. And that is why I caution against supporting these amendments that give Parliament power. Not just this House, not just the other House, Parliament. And I would urge noble lords to really reflect on that.
Will the noble lady agree with me that we should not ditch the principles of this House in order to please or pander to public opinion?
My Lord, I was not able to be present at second reading. My Lord, and in looking at this amendment, which is what this is about, my Lord, it is this amendment that...
Hear from the noble Lord Naseby, then hear from the Lord Tugendhat, unless anybody else wishes to speak. We'll move on to the front benches to conclude this debate.
My Lords, I shall be brief, but I concur with what my noble friend has just said. We forget in relation to this amendment the effect this is having on the ordinary people outside. They knew what they were voting about when they voted at the referendum. They were fed up with the way small restrictions were put on their life, more regulations were put on their lives. They were fed up with that, whether they were individuals or whether they were businesses. And we have to recognise that fact. Now, in relation to this amendment, it was my privilege in the other place to be Chairman of Ways and Means. 500 amendments to the Maastricht Bill. Many more chucked out. And they were thrown out, the ones that were not successful, because they were out of order. They were wrecking amendments. They were amendments that were defective. And I find it quite extraordinary that your Lordship's House is spending several hours here on what is basically a defective amendment. There are better ways. Now, if the Lord Panic isn't capable of putting down an amendment that is in order, then so be it. But he's a highly creative lawyer, and there are other lawyers looking on the liberal benches who perhaps can produce an amendment that is not defective, in which case this House should rightly debate it. But as we stand here today, this amendment is defective on all four of the elements of it. And noble lords should bear in mind that it is not wise for our House to vote on amendments that have huge implications and which are defective. It is much more sensible to take it back, or maybe on another occasion find some means to move forward. And we come ultimately to the ultimate situation. I trust our Prime Minister. I trust the noble member David Davis to negotiate well. I trust them to do their very best for the ordinary people who have voted for it all. And so, frankly, what we are doing this afternoon, if we're doing anything, is to undermine the public's confidence in this House. Now, confidence is a very, very delicate flower. And it affects not just us here, not just the public. It affects all the nation, all the businesses, all commerce, and we should not be undermining that confidence. So I suggest certainly I will not be voting for this amendment.
My Lords, as the House knows, I speak as one who very much regrets the result of the referendum, but who now feels that we must put it behind us and we must work to create the best possible relationship which we can with the European Union. And I feel that this amendment is muddying the waters. I would remind the House of the words of that very wise woman, George Eliot, who said that among all forms of mistake, prophecy is the most gratuitous. And this amendment does, of course, go down the road of prophecy. We can have no idea how the negotiations are going to unfold. Personally, I feel more optimistic about them than some people, but we can have no idea how they are going to unfold, and we can have no idea what the parliamentary situation or the situation in the European Union or anything else will be in 2 years' time. We can only be certain of one thing, and that was the point made by my noble friend Lord Howard. Now, Lord Howard and I, generally speaking, disagree on matters relating to Europe, but he is, of course, quite right in the point that he made, and that is that the government will stand or fall by the way in which it conducts these negotiations. Whether there is a deal or whether there isn't a deal, the House of Commons will pass judgment on the government's performance. It will either support the government or it will reject the government. But either way, its will prevail, and that is a very simple matter. And that the amendment that that is being put forward this evening is one that would put in place a complicated structure which would make it very much more difficult for the House of Commons to assert its authority than would otherwise be the case. The purpose of the amendment, I quite understand that, the purpose of the amendment is to enhance the authority of Parliament. But the effect of the amendment would be to diminish the capacity of the House of Commons to hold the government to account. And for that reason, I hope very much that the House will reject the amendment.
My Lords, the amendment...
Carry on.
My Lords. My Lords.
We're doing something else.
My Lords. My Lords. My Lords.
I think I made it clear, and the House has certainly made it clear, it's time for front bench speakers.
My Lords, we've gone via all kinds of highways, byways, Aunt Sally's and red herrings. But mixing my messages, no doubt. But the central issue of this amendment is, in the words of my noble friend Lord Leicester, who's the master, ministers or Parliament? And the noble Viscount Lord Hilsham insisted that it was the implementation of taking back control for Parliament, and it shouldn't be taking back control for the executive. Parliament should be in charge, in the driving seat. And there have been various criticisms of the amendment which seem to me to be more properly directed at the Prime Minister's assurance in the White Paper, because, and I think the noble Lord Pannick originally used this phrase, it gives the Prime Minister what she asked for. And to call, in the words of the noble Lord Hill of Orford, that it adds to the complexity, and noble Lord Tugendhat said it made it more complicated and muddied the waters. Well then, why did the Prime Minister pledge approval by both Houses of Parliament? As the noble Lord Cormac said, and I think the noble Lady Baroness Mackintosh, this is putting an assurance, an undertaking given by the Prime Minister into a statutory obligation, and it is wise and sensible so to do. And there is no basis whatsoever for the assertion made variously by noble Lord Lawson, Lord Forsyth, and the Right Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of York, that it would give this House a veto. The government, given that the Prime Minister offered to give approval by both Houses of Parliament. Presumably the Prime Minister, and she shared this with the government, knows how that would work. And it is for the government to deal with that process, which could, of course, as other noble lords have mentioned, be avoided if there was primary legislation, because then the rules are clear. The noble Lady Baroness Stowell counsels against an amendment that gives Parliament power, which I found a strange piece of advice. Surely Parliament has the right to such power as we possess under the Constitution, but it seems to be that it's not normal to have parliamentary power in some kind of parallel universe that Brexit has created. It does not weaken the government's bargaining position. The statement, "I've got to get it past my legislators," is perfectly good enough for a US president or EU negotiators, and it should be more than good enough for the British Parliament. The noble Lord Hill said that our EU partners read our debates. Yes, they might well do, and they will in this case. But they know that we in this Parliament want a really substantial content to a future relationship. We might even stiffen the government's backbone in the negotiations. And I agree with the noble Lady Baroness Simons of Vernham Dean that getting the best deal and parliamentary sovereignty, far from being in conflict, go hand in hand. Finally, Brexiteers seem to claim that this is a wicked plot by Remainers. But in fact, some of them seem to find Parliament an inconvenient obstacle to their dream of crashing out of the EU altogether, because they want the government to be able to action no deal, and they don't want Parliament to be able to say, hang on, is that actually a good idea? And that is why this amendment is extremely valid.
My Lords, I feel we've actually heard this afternoon a really compelling case for what is actually quite a simple demand. The right of Parliament, rather than government, to authorise the arrangements whereby the Article 50 negotiations conclude. Indeed, in fact, no additional words probably are needed to strengthen the case made by the noble Lord, Lord Panic, or indeed many of the others who've spoken. I won't mention them all, but you'll forgive me if I mention my noble friends Baroness Kennedy the Shores, Baroness Simons, Baroness Altman, Baroness Mackintosh, and Baroness Ludford. What have they got in common? So I must also mention Baroness Stoll, although she sadly wasn't able to support the case. And essentially, it is about implementing the Supreme Court view that withdrawal would require parliamentary authorisation. So, my Lords, the argument is straightforward. As the noble Lord Heseltine said, it secures in law the government's commitment that Parliament is the ultimate decider. Very shortly, maybe even next week, the Prime Minister will trigger Article 50 of the treaty. But neither that treaty, nor indeed any UK law, states how the arrangements made by our government should be made into law. What is written in the treaty, in EU law in other words, is that the final agreement will go to the Council and to the European Parliament. So it is mandatory for that Parliament to give its consent, but there's no similar requirement for this Parliament to give its consent. The Prime Minister has said she'll allow a vote in both houses, and as the noble Lord Forsyth quoted Mr Jones saying, it was the intent, but that to me is not a very firm commitment, no matter how sincerely it was given. Indeed, when the noble Lord the Minister in committee said that the government's oral commitment mirrors the powers of the European Parliament, he wasn't exactly right, because their power is written in law. So, my Lords, all we're asking is for an equal legislative requirement for the exit deal to come to Parliament. It's basically about Crown prerogative against Parliament's. Now, if I could turn to the no, not the West Lothian question. The Grocott question. He no longer has a constituency. We'll have to call it the Grocott question, and indeed raised by the learned Lord Mackay. Now, my Lord, it's true that whether we're looking at the undertaking given by the Prime Minister or this amendment, there would indeed be a problem if the House of Commons was to vote one way and your Lordship's House another. I hope that isn't the case for lots of reasons. Particularly, I hope by then, not just the country, but Parliament has come together and we are of one view. But may I make it clear from these benches that if there was to be an outcome, we are absolutely clear that ultimately the will of the Commons must prevail. Furthermore, if that is the only argument given against this amendment, then there are two ways of answering. Can I just conclude this? Then there are two ways of answering that. One is that we do a bit of hurried work this evening and we do an amendment. And if the government was willing to accept that, that might be the easiest way to do. Keeping all my friends here late into the night, however, may not be the best way of achieving that end. And what we wouldn't want is to risk voting down the idea of Commons supremacy just because, very sensibly, everyone was back in their beds. But the real issue is to get this principle into this bill and down the road into the Commons. And on behalf of the opposition, if that is the only point of dispute between us, given that we want the supremacy to be down there rather than here, then we will happily work with the government on the form of words to make that absolutely crystal clear.
Be very brief, but bearing in mind the emphasis she has put quite rightly on the two houses coming together, would it really be intrinsically so nerve-wracking, fearful and awesome for the Commons to for once to accept a Lord's amendment like this?
I think the Commons should certainly accept this amendment, albeit I'm happy with the tweak to enforce or to make certain the Commons amendment. I think the most supremacy. I think the most important thing is to get this amendment on the face of the bill, so that we are absolutely clear about that. Really, it's so simple. It's whatever the outcome of the negotiations with EU27. It's Parliament that's not simply the government where authority lies, deal or no deal. And I'm afraid I didn't follow the Minister's response on this last week in committee, questioning what would happen if the EU terminates the talks and refuses to extend the negotiations. He asked, what then? It's pretty simple. Come back to Parliament. My Lords, stranger still than here, that is the briefing coming out of number 10, with advisers arguing that giving legislators the power to veto the final Brexit deal and send the Premier back to the negotiating table would undermine her and limit the possibility of a good deal. Indeed, even pushing EU to give bad Brexit deal, incentivising it, it seems, in the hope it stops us leaving. That was what the Downing Street apparently told the Financial Times, and I always believe Financial Times. May I again remind the House, it was Mrs May who said that the deal would be put to a vote in both houses. So all of this is real nonsense. The only issue is whether it is an undertaking or in the bill. All we are doing in this amendment is to put her pledge, I'm sure absolutely sincerely given, I do not question that, put it on the face of the bill. It's hardly starting a revolution. It's certainly not upending the referendum. And any arguments of that, I think, are actually in bad faith, because what we're trying to do is put the Prime Minister's undertaking on the face of the bill. We don't want the government's hands to be forced by the courts. We want the vote to be clearly in the bill. ideally with the government's blessing, without even the need for us to divide, because they need to provide the certainty at this stage, so we are not back having this debate in 18 months' time. It's about authorising Parliament. It's to put wheels on the outcome of the referendum.
My Lords, the debate this afternoon has shown this House at its very, very best. And I'd like to thank all the noble Lords who've spoken. After, I think, 44 hours of debate now on these 137 words, it shows how sprightly your Lordships are. I would like briefly, before I discuss the amendments, to set out three core principles governing our approach to this country's withdrawal from the European Union. First, the government is determined to honour and deliver on the result of the referendum. The United Kingdom is going to leave the European Union. Second, everything we do will be determined by our national interest, and we shall do nothing, my Lords, to undermine it. Third, parliamentary sovereignty is key. Parliament will have a role in scrutinising the government throughout the negotiations and in making decisions, a point on which I will return. Given this, my Lords, let me now turn to the rationale and the motives behind my noble friend Lord Cormac's and the noble Baroness Hayter's and the noble Lord Panic's amendments. My Lords, one basic intent is that the government should be legally bound to deliver on its commitment to give Parliament a vote on the agreement. And that government commitment is crystal clear. Let me repeat it. To bring forward in motion on the final agreement to be approved by both Houses of Parliament before it is concluded. We expect and intend that this will happen before the European Parliament debates and votes on the final agreement. So, my Lords, the need for my noble friend Lord Cormac's amendment and for the first three clauses of the noble Lord Panic's amendment and the noble Baroness Hayter's amendment really does come down to a judgment as to whether ministers and the government can be trusted, and for one to consider the consequences if the government were not to deliver on this commitment. All I can say is that, of course, we will honour our promise, and Parliament will hold the government to account for doing so. And let me go further and echo a point very well made by my noble friend Lord Howard. At any point throughout this process, Parliament will be able to express its view. Now, my Lords, given all of this, the other place was happy with this state of affairs. They considered and rejected similar amendments. Furthermore, Parliament will not be providing scrutiny in the dark. After all, my Lords, this government has committed to keeping the UK Parliament at least as well informed as the European Parliament as the negotiations progress. The government will continue to be accountable to Parliament via regular statements, which I so enjoy, debates and select committee appearances. And crucially, Parliament's role will not be just one of scrutiny. My Lords, it will make decisions and shape the legislation required to give effect to our withdrawal from the European Union, the Great Repeal Bill to repeal the ECA, and also legislation that will be required for significant policy changes such as on immigration and customs. So, with the greatest of respect to both my noble friend Lord Cormac and the noble Baroness Hayter, any amendment which attempts to transcribe the government's commitment into legislation is, in our view, unnecessary. And more than being unnecessary, an amendment that sought to put this commitment on the face of the bill could have unintended consequences and create, as has been said, a lucrative field day for lawyers. But I don't, my Lords, want to single out any particular lawyer in particular, but I have one in mind. As the noble Lord Lisvane put it so well at committee, regulating parliamentary proceedings by statute generally ends in some sort of tears. Now, my Lords, other noble Lords have asked whether someone might argue that we need an Act of Parliament to authorise our exit from the European Union, and whether this bill is sufficient for our withdrawal. My Lords, the requirements of the Miller judgment are entirely fulfilled by this bill. The Supreme Court ruled that because withdrawal from the EU involves removing a source of domestic law in the UK, and because of the far-reaching effects of the European Communities Act, the authority of primary legislation was needed before the government could decide to give notice under Article 50. The Supreme Court did not rule that anything further was required to satisfy our constitutional requirements. And let me now turn then to Clause 4 of Amendment 3 in the Noble Baroness Lady Hayter's name. I have to say there's something about Labour in Clause 4, my lords, but we'll put that to one side. The motive behind this clause was summarised by the Noble Lord Panic at committee and again today. And he said, and I quote at committee, "Parliament should decide whether we leave the European Union with no agreement or whether we leave the European Union with whatever agreement is being offered to us by the European Union that the government thinks is unacceptable." And as the Noble Lord Panic said, this clause, Clause 4, goes beyond what the government has committed to in the other place. And there are several problems, my lords, with this clause. The first concerns the government's role as negotiator, and one of my first principles, protecting our national interest. For when considering this amendment, my lords, we must ask ourselves whether it will strengthen or weaken the government's hand at the negotiating table. Now, my lords, remember the wise words of this House's Select Committee, and I quote, "The government will conduct the negotiations. The government will conduct the negotiations on behalf of the United Kingdom, and, like any negotiator, it will need room to manoeuvre if it is to secure a good outcome." And let us not forget the motion passed by the other place, that nothing should be done to undermine the negotiating position of the government. But this clause in this amendment, my lords, would do just that. By denying, let me continue please, by denying the Prime Minister's ability to walk away from the negotiating table, as Clause 4 would do, this would only incentivise the European Union to offer us a bad deal. The European Union must see, my lords, that there are a number of people in Parliament who do think any deal is better than no deal. And we have heard some argue just now that to go to WTO terms would be bad for Britain. Therefore, surely, my lords, this amendment simply makes the negotiations much harder from day one for the Prime Minister, as it increases the incentive for the European Union to offer nothing but a bad deal. And I know some have argued that this clause will strengthen the government's hand. They say that this is like a CEO saying, "My board won't agree with that deal." But, my lords, this analogy is not correct in this case. Most boards would say, "We want to do a deal, but not at any price." In this case, a number of parliamentarians are saying any deal is better than no deal. So, my lords, I would argue this approach would weaken the government's position. But, my lords, that is not the only problem with this amendment. The amendment is clear, forgive me, the amendment is clear on one thing only. Namely, if Parliament agrees with the Prime Minister that no deal is better than the terms on offer, the United Kingdom will leave the European Union without a deal. But, my lords, it is unclear, totally unclear, on what happens if the House says no to walking away. As the noble and learned Lord Phillips of Worth and my noble friend Lord Forsyth asked, what path must the Prime Minister then take? Is she to accept the terms on offer? Is she being told to secure a better deal? And if so, what would happen if that can't be achieved before the end of the 2-year period? Or, my lords, in the silence of the amendment on this matter, is she to find a means to remain a member of the European Union? My lords, we don't know any of these points. And, my lords, my noble friend Lord Forsyth was entirely right to highlight this omission. The government cannot possibly accept an amendment which is so unclear on an issue of this importance, on what the Prime Minister is to do if Parliament votes against leaving with no agreement. And with that risk, my lords, let us remember the first principle I stated. The government is intent on delivering on the result of the referendum. As a matter of firm policy, and I almost turn to the noble Lord Kerr to repeat the words after me. As a matter of firm policy, Article 50 will not be revoked, And so, my lords, any question of whether Article 50 is legally reversible is irrelevant to the government. The parliamentary vote we have promised will be a very meaningful vote. We will leave with a deal or we will leave without a deal. That, my lords, is the choice on offer. But the choice offered by this amendment, by clause 4, is unclear. So, my lords, let me end by repeating line 1 of the White Paper. We do not approach these negotiations expecting failure, but anticipating success. Our clear intent, as I said, is to negotiate a new partnership with the European Union, which enables us and Europe to continue to trade freely together and to cooperate and collaborate where it is in our interests. Parliament will decide on whether to accept or reject the agreement. The purpose of this simple bill